Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this book launch event hosted by the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society. I'm Mark Pennington, I'm the director of the Centre. This event is part of a series of events we're doing on the political economy of knowledge and ignorance. And one of the important themes that we're looking at within that project is the relationship between different types of knowledge, different ways of knowing and how they inform decision making, the relationship between science and non-scientific forms of knowledge, problems of learning and understanding in situations where there are non-linear relationships between variables, and also problems of scientific understanding and how that informs policymaking in situations where there's an absence of counterfactuals. So all of these factors are part of what we consider to be the political economy of knowledge and ignorance. And it's within that context that I'm delighted that we've got here with us this evening Zeynep Pamuk, who's going to be talking about her wonderful new book, which engages with many themes related to what I've just enunciated. And her book's called Politics and Expertise: How to Use Science in a Democratic Society. So without further ado, please welcome Zeynep Pamuk.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark, for the invitation to speak, for the introduction. Thank you all for coming out here on this cold and dark December night. I was really happy to discover your center because my office is right across the street at the London School of Economics. So it was great to find colleagues working on exactly the same intersection of issues about politics, knowledge, ignorance, expertise, science. So this book is about the relationship between politics and expertise, specifically democratic politics and scientific expertise. The COVID-19 pandemic made the first line of this talk kind of redundant. The dependence on scientific advice of all countries around the world is now something that is taken for granted. It was always that way in a way. Climate change, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, nuclear weapons, these and many other issues, environmental issues, issues of technology, always brought into the political realm the findings, the research of scientific experts. On the other hand, we see denial and distrust of science. This varies by issues a little bit, but climate change is an especially egregious example where distrust of science and scientists runs very high. There's some global variation on distrust of science, but it can be found in every country. It varies by issues, and interestingly, it spans the ideological spectrum. So it's not necessarily a left-right thing. It varies a lot by issues where people distrust the expertise coming from scientists. We see appeals to the authority of experts and the ignorance of the citizenry on the one hand, and denial and distrust on the other. And I take these two things to be two sides of the same coin. Denial and distrust usually leads to more appeals to the authority of experts. Appeals to the authority of experts can lead to a backlash that results in more distrust and more denial, and on it goes. Now, the question that I take up in this book is how can democracies use science productively, and how should science be governed in a democratic society? So there are two different aspects to the question. One is about science informing democratic policies or government. The other is about democratic politics in turn informing science. And these two issues used to be treated very separately. So one was an issue about science policy, kind of a slightly boring, fusty area of how should research be governed, how should funding be allocated, and the other was a different issue of how expertise gets used in politics. And I see these two to be very closely related, and I treat them as such. So there's a diagnostic task in the book, which is to explain the tension between democracy and expertise. I think this tension is inherent to the logic of democracy. Experts present a rival source of authority in democratic politics. Their authority is based on truth rather than the agreement of citizens, so the source is simply different. The problem I take up is not the problem of epistocracy, whether it would be better to be ruled by experts. There's an interesting literature on this, but I bracket that. My question takes for granted that that we want democracy for various other reasons, independent reasons, that I don't completely justify from scratch, and ask, how can a democratic society that depends on scientific expertise deal with it in a productive way? The experts in the book are scientists. They're not career bureaucrats. Mostly they're academic scientists, but also serve in advisory roles in scientific advisory committees, for example. This problem, it didn't start after the Second World War, but it certainly became more prominent a problem after the Second World War because of the close connection, the increasing ties between politicians and top research scientists after the war, especially in the United States. The role of the scientists in winning the war gave them a special standing in the political realm. So this created these issues around the influence of scientists. And it also transformed the scientific enterprise. So it used to be more of a small scale thing. Maybe richer people would do it, or it wouldn't require so much funding. But after the war, it became this huge state-sponsored enterprise that depended on the government for funding, and the scale just grew enormously. So it became a big enterprise. So I start with what I call the Weberian model. Sometimes it's called the conveyor belt model or the division of labor model. It rests on a fact-value dichotomy. It's been challenged by other people as well. The idea of the model is that the relationship between expertise on the one hand and politics on the other is that experts or bureaucrats do the factual parts in a neutral way, and then this informs politics, which brings the value orientations necessary for political judgment. So there's a kind of sequential logic built into it, and it's based on the idea that expertise can be neutral. Well, it doesn't necessarily assume that it can be, but at least it should aspire to be neutral and value-free, and politicians should bring their values. This model is very much present in popular discourse. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw again and again that we don't want scientific advisors to set policy ends. We just want them to provide the science, and then politicians would make decisions about what best to do. And in the political theory literature and the academic literature, we see this model in various ways endorsed or defended by people like Habermas, Tom Cristiano, Philip Kitcher. So people who work in this area end up endorsing something like this still. My criticism of this model is that it does not sufficiently question the reliability of expertise, what happens when expertise itself is incomplete, uncertain. It does not focus on the role of values in the production of expertise itself, and takes expertise to be reliable and value-free. So instead, I argue that we should start from the choices made earlier in the scientific process and pay more attention to the uncertainty, incompleteness, and fallibility of science, and that will change what we do with the science, how we treat expertise in the political realm. So the book starts by focusing on the production of science. And I argue that completeness in knowledge is an impossible ideal. It doesn't make sense to think about scientists aiming for complete knowledge. So to understand the kind of knowledge, scientific knowledge we have in a society, we have to focus on judgments about what counts as significant knowledge. Scientific inquiry is not a random accumulation of truths either. So there are certain judgments about what matters, what is interesting, what is significant, what is relevant, what serves our values that scientists aim to discover. So science can be thought of as seeking out and organizing a body of significant knowledge. What constitutes significance is complicated. Many different factors will play into it, but some possibilities are the constitutive purposes of scientific disciplines. So some scientific disciplines have at their core an idea of what kinds of knowledge or sometimes what kinds of practical aims are significant. So some ecosystem biology, for example, has an aim that is more closely allied with conservation. Other disciplines are not oriented to a practical aim in this way. There might be practical, technological, or administrative goals. So you might have a particular technological end in mind. The moral, cultural, and political values of scientists, or simply what they're curious about, what they want to know more about. And of course, most importantly, the availability of funding. So what funding bodies will support determines what kind of knowledge we will end up getting. Now, these judgments about what is significant, what is relevant, what is interesting are not just made at the stage of scientists picking their topics. So they inform many different stages in the scientific process. So they shape the formation of concepts. I think in social sciences, this is even clearer, but also in the natural sciences, there are examples of certain concepts that involve that build on what scientists take to be significant. It shapes the selection of different hypotheses. Obviously, the hypotheses that scientists test have to come from somewhere, and they don't necessarily always come from earlier findings. That certainly plays into it, but they also come from what scientists think might explain things, or what they consider interesting, what they consider to be provocative, or what have you. Modeling choices. So we see many different kinds of trade-offs about what you approximate in a model, which processes you want to represent at a more fine-grained scale, and what processes you can bracket. So this is something that I discuss in some detail about climate change models. There are many different the global climate is highly complex, so scientists make many representations. And in the process, you get a focus on certain processes over others. So for example, in climate models, we often had global mean temperature rise being a prominent process that was explained really well, but you didn't have local patterns, local precipitation patterns, or sea level rise that would affect certain areas. Or you saw these disparities on the global scale, so there's a lot less information about Africa, whether that was because of the absence of data or whether scientists simply did not pay enough attention. So these kinds of factors that we might call practical factors, or in some cases value-driven factors about what's significant, shape the models that we get and what we can learn about and how we learn about it. Judgments about what determines evidentiary quality. Different disciplines have very different thresholds of evidence, and also what they will accept as rigorous evidence. So the debate around evidence-based policy, you may be familiar with that. That has its own very particular definition of what counts as quality. And it's held as the gold standard, but it's a subjective decision about where to pitch that standard, and it prevents scientists from explaining certain things because the evidence doesn't meet that quality, which means certain areas of study, certain population level processes go understudied because it's simply difficult to meet those standards with the kinds of evidence available. So it has a certain trade-off between rigor and ability to explain. And this is also a subjective judgment. The composition of randomized control trials, the kinds of, once again, this is a trade-off between rigor, but also decision about inclusion versus avoiding messiness. I was just recently reading an article about how medical trials don't have enough Black people for whatever reason. They are just not participating enough, so the knowledge around them about them is much weaker quality. So these factors, again, determine the contours of what we end up knowing. So scientific research is shaped by these value judgments about significance, relevance, and also the acceptability of different kinds of mistakes. Here we see the trade-off between rigor or a high evidentiary threshold and accepting that certain mistakes will happen and maybe taking that risk. Science may be correct, but it can still be partial and therefore inadequate for use. So this is about the incompleteness of the knowledge that we get. The available scientific explanations determine the possibilities for political decision-making and policy. So what is considered feasible depends on what we know about different options. If something has not been even considered as a possibility, if no knowledge exists, we cannot consider that to be feasible, even though we don't know that it is infeasible either. And similarly with what we consider to be desirable, if evidence exists on a certain issue that shows that policies are either likely to succeed or likely to fail, then we have more knowledge about that. What is not tried cannot really guide policy. But accurate explanations can be trivial, irrelevant, partial, so the availability of an explanation shouldn't be guiding or having a disproportionate impact on policy, but it ends up doing so just because it's there and you shouldn't probably bracket knowledge that exists. So what scientists have paid attention to, what has been funded, the way things have been studied, acquires disproportionate significance in the absence of alternatives. Better to rely on knowledge than not. This diverts attention from possibly more significant explanations or explanations that other people would have considered significant understood differently, and the policies that they could ground. So we don't know, we don't have a counterfactual for what we could have had, what we could have done if different kinds of scientific knowledge had been available to us. So I argue that this creates a problem for democracy. So far I've been talking about kind of the contours of the scientific knowledge available in society and how that's shaped. But I argue that this is a problem for democracy because democracy requires citizens to have the opportunity, equal opportunity to influence, contest, and challenge decisions, policy decisions. But if the values assumed in the science, during the scientific process, shapes these decisions, but it does so in a way that appears to be just part of the science, part of the expert part of a decision, then an important component of policy is shielded from input and scrutiny. So a lot of these decisions I mentioned about climate models or about public health, about randomized control trials, they're not usually what is debated at this stage of policymaking. Usually it's a matter of just applying the knowledge brought by scientists to a particular problem, but a lot of the work that affects what can be done, what's feasible, has been conducted at an earlier stage of the scientific process. So I don't frame the issue as one of expert domination because I don't take experts to have direct power to shape the decisions of citizens, although I've been pressed on this. People have said, why don't you say the problem is a more serious one, call it domination rather than a problem about the role of values or representation and how that affects the opportunity to influence. I've considered it. I mean, I'd be interesting to hear from you about whether you think the problem should have a more serious name. And I also don't think the problem is about truth or falsehood. Now, I understand and admit that, of course, we have false scientific findings. In some cases, these are mistakes. In other cases, they are simply science that's been done badly, or in the worst kinds of cases, we have experts for hire producing bad science for particular purposes. Of course, in the climate change debate, this was a big concern. So I'm not bracketing it because it's not serious, but rather because we know more about this. We've heard more about merchants of doubt stories. So my focus is let's say it is true, or it's likely to be true. Is there still a problem? And I think, yes, there's definitely still a problem. And even if we say, oh, mistakes are part of the scientific process, so it's not fair to blame scientists for mistakes, I agree with that too, but the issue is elsewhere. So democracy requires citizens to have the opportunity to influence and the ability to hold governments accountable, but that has to be directed toward the science itself rather than start from the process of taking the science for granted and then thinking about how to apply or use it. So I argue that to address this problem, science itself must be open for democratic scrutiny. Okay, so here's one example. Actually, I'm giving another talk here at KCL in January where I will talk more directly about COVID-19 and how scientific advice was used during the pandemic. So you can hear more about that then, but here is an example of the kinds of things I'm talking about at work during the pandemic. So in the earlier stages of the pandemic, I think around February or March, Imperial College in the United Kingdom and the Institute for Health Metrics Evaluation in Washington in the US produced these models which greatly shifted the policy approach that the US and the UK, and then following the many other countries, would go on to take. So these models predicted a massive death toll, much larger than was assumed at that point, but they were based on somewhat controversial assumptions about what mattered. So first of all, there was no modeling of social behavior and how people would respond to a pandemic. The idea that they would change their behavior, that they wouldn't continue behaving in the same way, that was bracketed. There's no modeling of differential effects, so all they cared about was the death toll, but they didn't study how different kinds of policies might affect have different effects along racial, ethnic, and class lines, but that turned out to be a huge issue as we saw different policies affected different groups differently. Health was measured in terms of total death count, that's one measure of health, certainly. It's an important one, but it's not the only one, and there are many other things that were bracketed. The economic and social impacts of lockdown policies were not included. The mental and physical toll of isolation, economic downturn, increased domestic violence and substance abuse rates, delayed treatments for other diseases, and mixed vaccination schedules for children were all left out. So you might say, in hindsight, it's easier to say that these things were left out, and they didn't have enough knowledge at that point. They just wanted to model how many people would die. And you can say this is a blame-free account. I'm just pointing out that the assumptions that go into a model affect what you're going to think is important and what you're going to act to prevent. So the big death toll that was predicted became the target of policy responses. These countries went into severe lockdowns in the coming months. Okay, what is the solution I propose? So there are a few different things, but they are united by the idea that scientific disagreement should be oriented toward the public audience, and science should be open for public scrutiny. So this, I argue, should start at an early stage of scientific research, but at the stage where science is being used for policy, what we want is for the assumptions and the values and the trade-offs made during the science to be exposed, scrutinized publicly, so that we understand what has been assumed to be significant, and how that has shaped and is going to shape the policy responses that are possible. So I have some proposals for restructuring the scientific advice process in ways that will facilitate public debate. So part of the challenge, or maybe the main challenge, is to make possible this kind of scrutiny under conditions of asymmetric knowledge, obviously, where experts know more than citizens and policymakers alike. So I propose more transparency, more openness about assumptions and uncertainty. But I also think transparency will probably not be enough, not least because scientists themselves often are not in the best position to recognize their own assumptions as assumptions. They might just think, that is what's important, or it's not a value, it's just science. So I advocate for scientific disagreements or scientists coming from different perspectives, exposing these judgments in front of a public audience. So for the advisory committee, I argue that they should avoid consensus judgments. This goes against scientific advisory committee practice because in many countries, as we saw during the pandemic, scientific advisors present a united front. They disagree behind closed doors, and then they advise one thing. They say, this is what ought to be done, and they speak as a united body. I say that prevents understanding the considerations that went in. So avoiding consensus judgments. Scientific advisors could provide written dissents and minority opinions. This is an idea I borrow from the US Supreme Court and generally how courts disseminate their ideas. And one of the justifications for doing that is to better understand the debate, to expose the grounds for disagreement, and also to facilitate further democratic deliberation going forward. So a court decision stands for that period, but going forward, there can be a debate around what's best, and this can lead to changing the laws, or in the scientific case, decisions are always reversible in a democracy, so organizing disagreement and allowing for more deliberation going forward, scientific advisors can set the tone in a way. But I also argue for more democratic influence over science at earlier stages, especially focusing on the funding stage. So I have a proposal for a science court. This is meant to institutionalize some of the things I mentioned about the importance of scrutiny, about the importance of exposing the grounds of different scientific judgments, and following up on the idea that disagreement can be a good way to expose different scientific positions for scrutiny. So this is an adversarial institution where competing experts defend a different position on a policy question. I actually didn't come up with this idea myself. I found a prototype from the 1970s. So a science policy expert / physicist in the United States came up with a proposal of this sort, because that was a time when actually these questions of scientific expertise were really heated in the United States because of the power of scientists. That power declined over time, and maybe you could say it started going up a bit again. But so the idea that he proposed, it was much more technocratic, because he thought scientists should be judging between different scientific positions. It would still be open to the public, so that element was there, but he wanted the scientists to settle on what would be taken as the scientific position that would inform policy. And it also was based on a kind of fact-value distinction once again. So he said this should only be based on the facts. Scientists should settle the facts first and then give a recommendation to policymakers. I changed a few details. So I recommended a citizen jury instead of a panel of scientist judges. And I also don't follow him in a fact-value distinction, just have a kind of policy question organizing the issue. For example, do we want lockdowns or do we want more targeted policies, something like that. So there's a citizen jury, evaluates the expert statements and the practical considerations together and makes an advisory recommendation. So this institution is designed to reveal the assumptions and value judgments of each view while clarifying their level of uncertainty and the scope of disagreement while putting citizens in the seat of judgment. I also have 2 chapters on science funding. Here I first examine some of the justifications offered for science funding and its distribution, given the unusual expansion after World War II. So John Rawls, liberal political philosopher, offered he didn't write that much directly about science funding, but it falls under his general discussion of how a liberal society should fund the arts and sciences together. And he argues that the state should be neutral about conceptions of the good in funding public goods, and each citizen should only pay for benefits she wants. So in this treatment, science is just something that some citizens might be interested in funding, but it cannot be imposed on anyone else. So what's missing, and really kind of surprisingly missing, is that science also informs policy and has a great political impact. So it's not just some hobby thing that some scientifically inclined citizens might want to pay for with their extra money. It's a collective resource. And I think this power to fund science is an important democratic power that should be used in more conscious, more directed ways. So science is a means for effective policies. It's a resource for the democratic empowerment of citizens, for holding policymakers accountable. It can be. It's not always. It doesn't always work that way. And it's an important agenda setter for political debates, not just political debates, but also social, economic, technological transformation. So science funding of 10, 15 years ago greatly affects political debates and technological changes today. Or maybe science funding of 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So I argue that the determination of issue areas to be prioritized should be more democratic. So my proposals are a bit more fine-grained than this slide suggests. So I see some role for lotteries because of the uncertainty of knowing which kinds of scientific advances are likely to turn out to be most productive. But it's like a 2-tiered system, some broad agenda setting, and then some lotteries going beyond the current system of distributing according to some notion of merit or scientific merit. And I argue that there's an important democratic stake in ensuring diversity and preventing the monopolization of funding in the hands of funding bodies that are largely opaque and unaccountable to the broader public. Oops. Okay, so there's another chapter on science funding, which argues maybe a little provocatively that certain areas of scientific research should be banned altogether. One of my examples, ironically, was experiments with lethal pathogens. So this became an important issue during the COVID pandemic, gain of function research. So it was well known that this line of experimentation was really, really dangerous. There were scientists themselves who were arguing that it should not go forward. But there's no real process for centrally banning a certain area of research. So there's an IRB process that asks for, what security measures are you taking? Is your lab sufficiently high tech, and have you taken the measures? But there's no sense that the possibility of a pandemic is a global risk, and therefore more people should be involved in the decision about whether this should go forward. I think geoengineering has a similar structure. It's a very high-risk event whose impact falls on many, many more people than the ones involved in the experimentation. There are some groups that are going forward with this at the moment. I also find that to be a candidate area. My argument is not that geoengineering or pathogen research should definitely be banned, but that this should be a more politically debated and discussed issue. I think I'll stop there. There's more in the book, but I'm also here to answer any questions you have about what I left out or what I said. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Zeynep. So we've got a microphone here, so it doesn't amplify your voice, but it's just to record the questions, if that's okay. People are okay with that. So have we got any questions for Zeynep?
So I guess I have two questions. One is, there seemed to be, in some of what you were proposing, a slightly anti-representational impulse going on. Because some of what you're describing sounds very similar to what already goes on to me in the system, except that it occurs through representatives. So select committees do something very like, in the UK parliamentary system, very like what you're describing as the science court. It's just that MPs do the asking questions and the judgment rather than citizens. Similarly, the scientific funding is in part controlled by government, right? And our elected representatives do make decisions into... So I wondered, first of all, if you could say a little bit more about whether that is an important part of the project for you here, that the kind of representative democracy is not doing a good enough job, or is not a good enough model for what's going on. And then more briefly, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about your hostility towards scientific consensus. So it seems to me that there's a very reasonable principle of scientists should fairly represent the balance of opinion in their disciplines. But I also think that it is their responsibility to kick out pseudoscience or views that are sensationalist but actually not well backed up by the evidence. And one way in which they do that is by saying, look, the consensus among scientists is this is not true. The consensus among scientists is that climate change is real and caused by human beings. There are individual bits and pieces of research which may move against that, but being clear on the consensus is one of the ways in which we legitimate scientific conclusions. So I was unclear to what exactly the root of your concern about consensus was.
Yeah, excellent questions. On the first point, yes, so I do argue that leaving this just to the existing mechanisms of representation is inadequate. And as you point out, we have similar processes within parliaments already. I don't have a very original argument against that, but it does go back to arguments about the capture of these kinds of issues, especially technical issues, by special interest groups. And I think there's some sense that these more direct participatory processes for various reasons are less open to capture. This has also been challenged. So I can't say empirically I know for sure, but I'm following this line of reasoning. And I think the fact that these areas are far more complex makes it much more difficult for the standard processes of accountability, elections, or just general, following what's happening in Parliament to be enough for citizens to have an understanding of what's going on. So part of the idea is to create conditions where there is a higher chance of epistemic clarity, access, and understanding. And I think direct participation face-to-face is much better at this than the processes of the media or whatever else is usually used at the system level for accountability and understanding. I think there is an epistemic benefit to face-to-face participation for groups of citizens. Now, I don't mean to say that any of the processes that we have within parliaments should be bracketed or stopped, just supplemented in these ways. My hostility to consensus. So I have nothing against, if there is a large number of people who think a certain position, who have evidence that a certain position is correct, I think that should be represented. So I'm certainly against false equivalence. I don't mean to suggest that all views should be presented in an adversarial situation as having equal support. And certainly some views can and should be dropped. Now, I can say more about what kind of process that would be or who would decide, but I'm all for expressing how many people believe that climate change is real and man-made and so on. But one thing you said towards the end is about the role of consensus as a strategic device. And I'm much more hesitant to endorse that use, going beyond how the lay of the land within science. I think the opposite. I think when scientists use consensus as a strategic device, first of all, that assumes a high degree of confidence. And I think it's quite rare that there is such a high degree of confidence in anything. I think we can say that about the consensus around climate change now. Or maybe we could say that maybe 10 years ago, but we couldn't say that in like 1995 or 2000 when really this debate seemed like a live debate. So I think, yeah, once an issue has been established, but a lot of these are about issues where there's uncertainty. That's actually something I say as a qualifying point in the beginning of the book. These arguments are best applied to issues that are high uncertainty and high risk. That's one reason I don't like the strategic use of consensus. And the second is the risk of backfiring. So during the beginning of the pandemic, we saw scientific advisors in the United States kind of building a consensus of the Surgeon General, Anthony Fauci, and then Deborah Birx was the White House coordinator. They all took to different channels of communication and said, masks are not necessary. Masks do not help against the pandemic. Do not wear them. And I documented them making these statements. Of course, there was no such consensus. They didn't have any evidence. And even today, people are debating how much masks protect and to what extent, under what conditions. So they overstated for strategic reasons. And then that backfired. And in the United States, it was difficult to get people to wear those masks.
You propose the solutions on the accountability side of the matter, but could you specify or be more specific about what is the exact problem it's supposed to address? Because as I understand, it can be framed differently. So why we need to worry about accountability of scientists? Is it because they, despite being very clever people in their respective fields, still are ignorant as human beings and have epistemic limits, so they can unexpectedly or intentionally kill us by introducing something bad? Or is it about whether the response of the citizens to any proposals by the government based on the advice of the scientists, and how you then proceed with the policies which will benefit from scientists being accountable by the citizens or by at least the representative bodies? So I suppose the way the specific policy prescriptions are designed about accountability will depend on how you identify the issue and what are the consequences of not solving it. That's the first part, and the other one is you seem to contrast comparing how currently the decision-making process among the scientific bodies takes place, and that they tend to emphasize the importance of consensus, and say, and at least implicitly, it seems that you assume that in democracy institutions, that's not the case. That may be true about the legislative bodies, where we actually are exposed to the debates. We can go to the BBC Parliament channel and watch all the debates. But at the same time, other democratic institutions also work as a scientific bodies. We don't have insight into the cabinet meetings. Or I very clearly remember the situation at the White House office where Donald Trump meets Nancy Pelosi. It was the time when the Democrats have been blocking the proposal about the wall. And Nancy Pelosi says we should not argue in front of the camera. People should not see us arguing. So she has this view that we need actually to come with a consensus view. Obviously, Trump had reasons why he wanted it to be on the camera. So, what is the standard to which you compare the accountability and the approach to consensus? Yes.
Thank you very much. Two great questions. On the first question, I think my answer is going to be neither of the options that you mentioned. So it's not that scientists are fallible. I think scientists are fallible, but I don't think the democratic process is going to expose a scientific mistake that they've made. And it's not just to get citizens' opinions or reaction or strategic positioning on the policies either. It is about the role of values and judgments about what's significant, judgments about where to set evidentiary thresholds, so judgments about values that have been made at earlier stages. So how has this been framed? How does that framing affect what we can do? What does the way the science has been made tell us about what we consider feasible and why? So it's about the role of values in science that I think is the problem. And the reason why I recommend these accountability mechanisms is because I think it's best to try to expose those value judgments. And scientists themselves are in the best position to do so for other scientists. So they certainly have to be on board with this and participate. But these judgments are valuable for understanding science for use. The second question about the high standards. So it's a very interesting question. And I think it goes to maybe deeper issues about what points you want consensus in politics. And also, I think what you were saying had an element of when do you want secrecy versus complete openness. And I think the two may not map onto one another perfectly, because I think there is certainly a role for scientists to have some deliberations in secret. So my proposal is not that a scientific advisory committee meets completely publicly, although it can, and I also feel that I like that as well. So the Independent Sage in the UK actually broadcast some of their meetings on YouTube, and I think that was quite nice. But they don't have to, and I understand some reasons for some degree of secrecy, provided there's ability to get, I don't know, freedom of information requests and so on. But I think the consensus point is because once you present a strategic consensus, so not the kind that Jonathan was mentioning about there is an actual scientific consensus, but rather you strategically present a united front, like Pelosi saying, "Oh, let's stop and let's present our united front." And I think in that case, your is suppressing valuable information. So the idea that you should do that suggests that scientists know best, and really what they're trying to do is to get people on board strategically with their decision. Whereas I see the problem differently. I think we are better off knowing what the options are. So a few options considered and rejected are good to know about.
Good. Thank you very much. Great talk. I'm excited to finish the book, which I have started but not finished. So I have a smaller question and then maybe a bigger question. So I guess the smaller question is just about the role of the democratic public in scientific funding. It's like a mundane question, but I feel like there's been a lot of criticism of scientific funding bodies for being too biased towards policy relevant research and like not spending enough on like what people call blue sky research. So just like what scientists think might be intrinsically important for the knowledge of the world. I wonder if your proposal would like exacerbate that bias towards like policy relevant research and disincentivize like more pure science. The more practical, so my maybe bigger question is to stick up for Max Weber and say, because I think the people who are using Weber who you're criticizing are wrong, like Cristiano, but I think Weber was onto something a little bit more sophisticated than them, because he was worried about the fact value distinction, obviously, but he was really worried about the usurpation of political authority by scientists, and also about the abdication of politicians and the outsourcing of decision making to scientists, right? Which I think is part of the like COVID story. So it was a story about like you know, it's really convenient for politicians to say, well, the scientists are telling us to do this and abdicate. And I wonder how you see if you see your policy proposals as addressing that problem and how.
Yes, great question. So on the scientific funding part, this is partly why I have a two-stage proposal. The first stage being kind of more democratic allocation, and the second stage being some role for lotteries, because what we don't know, no one knows what's likely to be a productive area of research, and because there might be certain, so I think having a majoritarian bias in how you allocate your funding is probably not great in terms of supporting ideas that are likely to have the potential to really challenge the consensus. So I don't like scientists themselves giving it to already existing powerful paradigms, but I don't think a democratic process all the way down to distribution is going to do that either. Both are different kinds of majoritarian processes, and this is why I see some room for a lottery. But on the point about, so I don't pitch this at any point as a distinction between basic and applied. And I wonder, I don't know whether making a process more democratic is necessarily going to be interpreted as making it very policy relevant. I guess it depends on the preferences of people, of citizens, of policymakers. I feel like many people are really excited by certain, you know, kind of slightly fantastical scientific projects, like they find that fascinating and maybe would assign money for it, but maybe not. Maybe you're right. So, but the idea that scientists are the ones who are going to push for like some long-term grand project, and you know, ordinary people are like, do not think big in that way. They will want applied science. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what evidence is there for that. It could be the opposite, that scientists will push for incremental things because, you know, it expands their already existing approaches, and they will not seek for that grand discovery because, you know, if it fails, then you fail, so it's not rewarded. I think this is an interesting empirical area, like what kind of projects or proposals for distributing funding is likely to generate the most exciting revolutionary ideas. And I read those, I read studies on this. There are proposals, there's some computer simulations that assume different things and, you know, see if like followers or like complete mavericks that get to that threshold in a computer simulation. But I don't know. I don't know the answer. The Weber question, that's really interesting and valuable. And the way you present it, I think, so the first part I completely agree with, that the danger here is, of course, that these will be usurped by scientists, and so there is the logic behind the division of labor I am completely on board with. So I do not follow some people who say, well, actually, given that fact-value separations are impossible, have scientists make ethical decisions, or scientists make democratic decisions, whatever that may be. I find that to be very alarming. I don't want science to become this, you know, a thoroughly politicized process all the way down. So that's why some of my proposals, or most of my proposals, come at the end of scientific research, and some of it is at the beginning, at the funding stage, but I don't have political interference or a vision for values in science in that way. It's more about scrutiny ex post, so we understand what happened. But the second part about politicians abdicating their responsibility to scientists. So how does my argument, again, I find myself agreeing with that. So I think that would, I want the decisions to be made by scientists. So what you're saying is basically, yeah, I guess some of the representations of Weber are mistaken, but Weber himself is doing something that I would also find very congenial. So I like that comment. Thank you.
I also thought it was a brilliant presentation. You could say that some of the most powerful scientists are like the economists working in the Treasury or the Bank of England, and I wondered if you see any particular potential for your ideas to be applied in the field of economics.
Yeah, 100%. So in the introduction of the book, I say, you know, perhaps the worst offenders here will be economists and other social scientists. But I think the case there is so clear. And I think there are very few people who defend economics as a value-free science, economic advisors as disinterested, non-ideological actors in politics. I think the default view is that their quote-unquote science is not all that scientific. It's driven very much by their own politics. So I take that to be I say a fortiori this would apply to economics and to other social sciences, but I will take the harder case because I think many people don't think in that way about the natural sciences. And there is this kind of, slightly fictitious separation between social and natural sciences, which I don't think is like an actual separation. It's all continuous in my mind.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So I have two questions. The first one is about the literature that you're using, because this proposal of a science court reminded me a bit of the debate about science studies in the French sociology of science of 80s and 90s, so especially the work of Bruno Latour. So his proposal of a parliament of things as a forum for debating controversies, so scientific controversies. So I was wondering whether you also draw a bit from the literature. And the second question is about, if you could elaborate a bit on the relationship between the citizens' trust towards science and the fact that basically a science court will expose all the uncertainty behind scientific practices. So, of course, from what I understand, yours is an optimistic take. So, exposing more the uncertainties behind the scientific practices will increase this trust in science and in experts. But of course, a counter argument could be that exposing all the uncertainties and debates between scientists could actually increase the distrust in science. So, for example, this reminded me of the scandal about the IPCC mails in the early 2000s when basically climate deniers use these mails to show, scientists are using political choices and values to basically make a point of climate change. So what do you think about this? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So I definitely do read the STS debates and cases. I've read Latour for sure, but also feeding from the literature in more Anglo-American political theory, democratic theory about citizen assemblies, participatory experiments. So I think, having more direct participation and venues for participation for issues related to science, technology, expertise has a kind of now quite long history, actually, going, definitely back to the late 80s at least. So there are many, many proposals, and actually many of them have been implemented and tried out. So I do try to engage with some general strains, and that chapter is actually a lot about the nitty-gritty, what I would change, how I would rethink the processes. So I try to cite a lot of people, but I also try to say what would make this a little bit distinctive and different. For your second question, yeah, that's a tough question and a really important one. So you said optimistic. Maybe I'm being naive in my view about whether this would still retain some level of trust. So I've been following, there's a working group at Cambridge University which actually tests communication of uncertainty and the limits of science and tries to determine whether that decreases trust. Now, this is a widespread assumption, actually. So I do get this question a lot. People assume that if you expose the weaknesses of science or of a view, if you put it tentatively rather than certainly, then you're more likely to lose trust. But actually, this work in science communication or, psychology shows that that doesn't seem to be true. So there are certain ways of communicating uncertainty. For example, if you If you use vague qualifiers like somewhat or it's a bit uncertain, then maybe you lose some trust. But if you're a bit more precise about uncertainty and you know numbers seem to help, then you don't lose trust. And the idea that this will automatically have this effect just doesn't have enough evidence. But ultimately, it is an empirical question, and you are right that my view is definitely backed somewhat by a hope that it will turn out not to be that way, that actually sharing the weaknesses of your view will not lose trust, but will gain trust in what you're doing. The climate change emails example is an interesting one. It sometimes gets used in the way you framed it, that once people saw the emails trying to suppress things, then they distrusted it. But the thing is, they didn't share those emails. They didn't share the uncertainty. Their emails were hacked. So clearly they were playing around with the data and trying to do things in a strategic way. And this is why I worry about backfiring. So if they had been very open and they were like, actually, we don't have evidence for a lot of these things and we'll have to, we can't show what we said we would show, then if they had been very open about it themselves, rather than, falling prey to this hacking scandal, then maybe it would have gone differently. So that's not a case where the scientists shared their uncertainty and lost trust. It's a case where their uncertainty was exposed by other people, by some bad actors. And then the whole episode really did result in a loss of trust, a great loss of trust.
Thank you. That was super interesting, and also I wanted to, link to what someone asked before about, whether social sciences and political economy is actually equal or can be compared to what we call hard sciences. Because I've been wondering about this. This is also in a way an object of my own research, and in a way I don't think we can say this if I think of, for example, the case of climate change and financial regulation and financial policy, in a way, social sciences, what they do is they study the very institutions that are meant to, that are powerful and are meant to make the rules. So sometimes you get scholars that really take an approach that goes beyond the institutions that are meant to tackle climate change. So, in macrofinance, that says the central banks and fiscal authorities should cooperate differently. And these voices are never heard because the main point is that the current institutions are not fit for what they need to do, So, there is a sort of epistemic contradiction in where, if these voices can actually be heard by the institutions that you say, at the end will be policymakers and experts. Because if they argue for something that is very different from what already exists, their voices will probably just be silenced, and mainstream economics, for example, will still dominate because they're the ones that they say, oh yeah, climate change, you can use financial disclosure, and that's it. Just like your company tell us about your climate change risks, and that's it. So yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think maybe the way I framed the talk didn't bring out this element that you're mentioning quite as directly, but I think one of the things that I really want to emphasize is the importance of bringing to public attention or to institutional attention minority views or dissenting views or views that within the structure, the power structure of science itself would be not directly suppressed, but they wouldn't be as supported. They wouldn't find a role, in a consensus statement. And I think those views are valuable. They may not, even if they're wrong, they're valuable. But of course, there's a chance that they are the right ones, that they would really dramatically change our understanding of what's happening, how we should approach a problem. So I think part of the emphasis on adversarial mechanisms, challenging funding structures that are based on what's regarded currently as merit, all of these are designed to facilitate that kind of approach. So I completely agree with you.
I think that Cold War was a catalyst for specific consensus in society for funding that would be bipartisan and both democratic and non-democratic, as demonstrated by the United States, Soviet Union. We can also argue that this was the main driver, although there was some kind of an Occam's razor in projects such as Hadron Colliders or discovery of non-stable elements of the periodic table. I wonder, right now, I think that science and investments in science and the support for science became more of a partisan issue in democratic countries, and in the US. I think that a lot of Republican politicians would appeal to people who are or imply imply counter-scientific appeal to anti-scientific stances of their electorates, maybe implying to play as kind of a subtle political game and focus more on ethno-nationalism issues, whereas on the what we call the new left or the third way left, that would be more identity politics and the idea and those kinds of ideas. Do you think that how do you think we can regenerate that consensus for scientific funding? And do you think that projects that are how do we keep projects like nuclear fusion, which are made more in collaboration rather than in competition, as it was during the Cold War? Do you think they're being jeopardized by that kind of deglobalization and the rise of the far right and identity politics on the left?
Very interesting question. So I think the story about the decline of that of course, the Cold War consensus has declined in many areas of politics, but actually support for science and general support for scientific funding runs very high in the US, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. That might surprise you, but the issue where Republicans really distrust scientists is climate change. There they say, no, we do not trust the science on climate change. Whether they say that because they believe it or whether they say that because that's their identity, I don't know. But when you look at polls, support for science, whether we should continue funding scientists, whether scientists know what they are doing, it still runs pretty high, like at 85% or something. And in the US, in Europe, it runs even higher. But the places in the world where it runs lower, like Africa or Central Asia. So it's not clear that polarization has really affected support for science in the US as a general project. In this period, you see the rise of more private funding for science, and Republicans do like that, do prefer that generally as an approach to funding. So that's an important thing, philanthropic funding or just corporate R&D, but that doesn't fund those big projects of basic science. So I think maybe it's surprising that support for science runs so high and doesn't exhibit this polarization. So I would actually maybe reframe the issue, like how do you explain that? And I don't have a great answer. One thing about the polarization though, and this issue of whether people trust scientists on particular issues, there was an interesting poll during the pandemic where lots of people said across the ideological spectrum said they trusted scientists to know the right answer or to know the science of COVID. But Republicans and independents disagreed with the statement that I trust scientists to represent my values. And that, I think there's a clear reason why that's true. It's because most scientists, with some exceptional areas, are liberal or democratic leaning. So I don't know if that affects the science that they do. This is something I've wondered about, but it's very difficult to frame that question and study it. So that's certainly something that's happening.
Can I have a follow-up?
So it would be closer to the topic of the book, I guess. But as you said, there seem to be difference in conceptualization of science. That's what I've probably wanted to say. Depending on the parties or political preferences, and do you think that your ideas of scrutiny can help us understand, and how can help us understand that sort of left-right or maybe any other sort of politicization of scientific, of notion of science as a general concept, and for example, people on the right, they would probably say that the boring Elon Musk's boring company is science, but I don't agree with that. It's just building tunnels, which we have been doing for many years. So yeah.
Yeah. If you put the question that way, definitely. So I would hope that if the values involved are political values, directly party ideology-based values, that these processes would expose them, and then we could have a debate about whether that's healthy or what kind of policy follows from that, and so on. So that would absolutely be within the scope of my argument. I wanted to pitch it a bit more broadly because I don't think all the values involved map onto the political values, and that can actually be a healthy thing in some issue areas, but definitely would cover that. So yeah, thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for the talk. My first question is, do you think generally the scientific coverage in the media and the accountability that flows from it is inadequate? And if so, which I suspect you'll say yes, do you think that's the fault of the media in a lack of technical fluency, or the fault of more the wider public in a general lack of engagement or basic knowledge?
The problems with the media run so deep. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about the funding structure of the media itself and what incentives they respond to. There is some good science coverage, and there's some independent science journals and such that I think are quite good. So I don't think it's about the literacy of the science journalists. And when that works well, it can actually do really good, have really good effects on communicating science in a way that's accessible, makes it sound a lot more interesting than scientists themselves manage to make it sound, and reaching a broader public. But of course, that idealized kind of journalism is often not what we see in the mainstream. I think the problem is a broader one about the media and its own incentives and the polarization, the drive to, I don't know, quicken the pace of news. So I think it's in line with other issues of journalism, of the media environment as it stands now. And I think there are many issues. So it is a bit concerning, because I think that would be a way in which some of these proposals would really find a better uptake, or would be more effective combined with good scientific coverage. I think there's still some outlets that do a good job, but.
Thank you for your talk. I really appreciate it. I would like to bring forward the problem of the black people not being, being excluded from researches that led to a death of some of them because of a blood pressure tablet that was only tested in, and they only used the white men for the research, and it led to several deaths. I just would like to comment that I don't know whether you mention in your book or not, about women that's completely excluded from any research. That's why the book, The Invisible Women, that led, because of that, because, for example, shelves are made for men, not women. so much that women needs steps to reach some shelves and so on and so forth. So women is completely excluded from research that again led to death of women in tablets that were made for men and not women. Do you talk about that in your book or no? Not at all.
Yeah, definitely. So actually, I started getting interested in these issues after reading critiques by feminist philosophers of science who have argued that science, as it's done, has a particular value orientation. Not only does it bracket issues around women or exclude women from trials and so on, but the assumptions that they make are often taking a male perspective. So this made me, so these critiques were really powerful, and the literature I draw on, which focuses on values in science, actually is very closely driven by or building on these women, feminist philosophers of science. So that's a starting point, definitely. I then wanted to generalize from that, but there are definitely examples about women's issues. And there are also examples of women's movements or women challenging these structures of science, like the women's health movement in the 70s and 80s, pushing back on some of these male-driven research on contraceptives or reproductive rights and so on. So definitely I mentioned some of these issues in the book. Yeah, so thank you for bringing out, yeah, that's so important.
Thank you very much for bringing the important book to our attention and present it here. I think it's really an important line of research. I want to follow up a little bit on some of the questions on economics, political economy, and maybe minority views, and also maybe go back to your invitation to discuss whether talking about domination is actually appropriate. And so I maybe might have some other candidates how to think about this issue. And I wonder if you considered the fact that in the second half of the 20th century, Marxist philosophers were talking about the importance of epistemological break for science to have its rigorous status, meaning there need to be a break between lay opinions, ideology, and what we consider sort of impartial, objective, rigorous science, to the point that opinions really need to be purged from science. So we have this sort of hard break between scientific and lay knowledge that is built on this concept of the epistemological break, and it establishes hierarchies of different kinds of knowing. Maybe those that are rigorous, based on mathematics, maybe those are more general, maybe those are more valuable than tacit knowledge, or very specific accounts of one's knowledge about the specific time and place. So to the point that people who are seriously interested in decolonization, there is talk about epistemicide, where if you are actually considering certain kinds of knowledge as worth having, and these kinds of knowledge contain values that then help shape political decisions and help us decide what assumptions actually matter, then that might lead to sort of a genocide of certain kinds of knowledge, which might be held by certain kinds of people based on ethnicity or gender. And so these might be some other concepts, maybe complementary to the idea of domination. And I wonder if you thought about them or considered them in the context of your work.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you very much for that. I didn't directly consider those vocabularies, but I certainly was concerned with the issue of exclusion, of what kinds of knowledges get erased in the process. So a lot of my concern with what we know and what we don't know, the issue of absence, of ignorance, does focus on these kinds of, the exclusion of lay knowledge, experiential knowledge, indigenous knowledge, women's knowledge. So certainly these are the topics. When you look at what is left out, these really stand out. So maybe the words you suggest, the concepts, are good ones. I don't know how epistemicide or genocide in this context are define precisely, but I can sort of guess. So maybe these are welcome concepts for explaining the kinds of violence that can be done to groups of people, to cultures, to those who are already oppressed, but through an epistemic move. So I really welcome that. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions?
Thanks for the talk. I look forward to reading the book. So I was wondering if I could sort of characterize what I think is sort of really interesting about one of the things that you talked about earlier, and you can tell me if this sounds right, and then there's like a question that leads from that. So one of the things that I was thinking about in particular with the COVID-19 pandemic, with COVID essentially, was that oftentimes you would hear people say, right, you have to like trust the science, like I trust the science. And then oftentimes, you know, one of the forms of backlash that resulted from that were essentially all these people sort of like doing these kind of home tested remedies and saying like, I do my own research, right? This was like Facebook research, right? And what they really meant was like they went out and bought like ivermectin or something, or they heard from some hack scientist or some hack person, and they were like, I'm using this medication for horses to like try and cure myself of COVID. So like that sort of dichotomy was often set up between like trust the experts and I do my own research, right? And it seems to me like in that particular setup, the actual presumption on both sides of that debate is that this is purely a fact-based issue, right? I do scientific facts and I do my own facts or something like that, right? And it seems to me like one of the really distinctive things about the way that you presented this is that it's about essentially showing that because there is no value-free fact, it's actually the thing that needs to be done is to make the implicit values explicit, right? And part of the reason why like these sort of citizen groups are valuable is because although not all citizens have like scientific research expertise, the question about the debates over facts is essentially a political question, and therefore, right? So that's really interesting. I think that part is really compelling because it's a way of saying that like there's a way for citizens to be involved in science in a way that doesn't demand that they have like PhDs in chemistry or something like that, right? By saying the political question is one of value. So that's great. That's what I thought you were saying. And then I guess the follow-up, the kind of question that comes from that is, could you say a little bit more about how, do you think of these sort of citizens groups, I'm not sure, I don't remember what you called them, but as essentially changing the ways in which, for instance, like public health directives are shaped? As a result of this, because right now in the United States, for instance, it's just like the CDC. And that, as far as I know, is not informed by this kind of citizen involvement. So I was wondering if you could maybe say a little bit more about that, and if you think that would then make sort of public health. So in the US, right, there was just a lot of distrust in the CDC, at least from certain populations, right, about the CDC. And do you think this would therefore then like increase trust in like public health directives in places where that seems to be kind of low?
Yeah, exactly. So the Science Court is essentially an advisory mechanism whose political role would be like the CDC, except citizen-driven. So they would tackle similar questions and they would come with a recommendation. Now it's much more simplified, and the setting of the agenda presents it in a digestible form, so it's not the whole advisory process, but its product is an advisory recommendation that would have similar status. So whether you make masks mandatory or optional, whether you shut down schools or you don't, and the idea is exactly that this is not just about facts; it's about values. The science itself has values, and if you have citizens involved with both sides of the fact-value distinction, so to speak. So my hope is that it would get more trust. So I did look at some processes during the pandemic where, for example, vaccine allocation there was the general public health guidance. I don't know if it was CDC setting them, but there was guidance about how they should be distributed. And then like in some places, like in Boston, for example, I looked at this locally driven process where they were like, no, our values are different, and we look at the facts and we interpret them differently because the facts the facts of vaccine allocation, make some assumptions that we find controversial. These are the groups that we want to prioritize, looking at the data about, how many lives are likely to be lost in each group and the assumptions driving that. So I thought that was an exemplary process where you would have church representatives, teachers representatives, some scientists, it was kind of a process like that I think is ideal. So the court is a bit different, but the idea is exactly that this would also then gain more trust.
Okay, well, we've had quite a lot of questions there. I think we've given Zeynep quite an examination. I think she's done brilliantly on that. One thing that she has, if I may say so, failed to do is bring copies of the book for people to buy. So
I have failed, yeah.
What you can do is, go onto your devices or whatever and possibly purchase the book if you want to. I certainly recommend it. And she's going to be, she's our last event of 2022. She's also going to be our first event of 2023. She's giving a workshop on January 26th, I think it is.
That's right, yeah.
So you're all welcome to come along to that. And if you bring your books, maybe she'll actually sign them for you as well. So I'd like to say thank you very much, Zeynep.
Thank you so much for all these questions. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you all for coming. And if you would like to join us for some refreshment, just now behind, we've got some drinks, cakes, and various things out there. So please do join us and carry on the conversation. So thank you very much.